Just look at it. Did you notice that? Typo. I don't know. Good morning. Sorry for any confusion with our new start time of 9:30. Apparently even the board downstairs hadn't been changed, but hopefully over time people will feel it more merciful. Anyone who needs to commute during rush hour probably will. So good morning. I am Felicia Marcus, chair of the board, and today is Tuesday, June 6th at 9:32 a.m., and the meeting's called to order. With me are to my left, Vice Chair Stephen Moore, to his left, Board Member Didi D'Adamo, to my right, Board Member Tam Dodek, and to her right, Board Member Joaquin Esquivel. Mr. Loffer, as you are the acting executive director, would you like to, I feel like just throwing just a million tasks at you. But,
I think people
I know
have already
you can
done
handle
that.
them all, but would you like to introduce the staff that are assisting us today?
Yes. First of all, I'm joined to my right by Chief Deputy John Bishop. Chief Deputy Eric Oppenheimer is over at the Capitol for a number of meetings this morning. And then assisting the board today are Janine Townsend, clerk to the board, and Courtney Tyler.
Thank you. Great. For those who don't know our emergency evacuation procedure and those who need a reminder, take a look for the exit nearest you, and if you hear an emergency sound, grab your stuff, grab your friends, and proceed carefully down the stairs. If you need help, someone will help you get to a protected area. We meet in the Cesar Chavez Park near the corner of 10th and J. If you want to wait with us, you'll know when the all clear is sounded. Meeting is being webcast and recorded, so when you speak into a microphone, either the ones up here or that one, please get close enough that you can be heard, not so close as to make a staticky sound. And then perhaps most importantly, if you can silence whatever noise-making devices you have with you, that would be terrific. All right, now we're on public forum, which is the part of the agenda where we hear from anyone who wants to talk about a matter that is not pending before the board today. We have 3 today in the order they arrived, and we each can have 5 minutes. Be fine. We have Mike Steerley. Saw you. Hello again. From MDS Engineering, Chris Koper from Shasta CSD, and Libby Uramovic. Mr. Steerley.
Good morning. Thank you. I'm here to support the bid protest resolution and notice for Shasta Community Service District tank and pump station replacement project, Department of Water Service project number 4510013-004C. I'm essentially here to protest the funding of this project. This project was bid sometime back. MDS Construction's bid was actually going back. I was here last month,
right,
and you asked the council to look into the matter, and it was passed on to staff, and then it was they requested a response from Pace Engineering, and I'm responding to the errors and omissions in that letter. The letter states that the project MDS Construction's bid of $3,200,000 was rejected, and the second bidder, RTA, was to be awarded a project at $3,860,000, a difference of over $500,000. And it's my understanding that they requested additional funding for engineering, and it's out to bring it up to over $800,000. Now, there was 4 items that was discussed or brought up for the rejection of MDS's bid. The first one was alterations made to the bid. MDS Construction lowered their bid at the last minute and changed 2 items, the bid price and what have you. MDS failed to initial those 2 items. The second was a percentage of the project. There were, I think, 3 or 4 subcontractors, and you were supposed to put the percentage of the overall project of these subcontractors. And we ran out of time to do that, or didn't have the ability to do the calculations and what have you. Now, these 2 items here, in my 50 years of contracting, have never been grounds for throwing out a bid. The third item was the disadvantaged business enterprise, DBE requirements. We submitted the 2 that we thought were required and what have you, but to find out they wanted all of the documents submitted at the same time. We did not provide that. However, as you go down into the next paragraph here, the RTA was, let's see, RTA Construction found a minor, PACE found a minor defect in the bid package that did not alter the prime types or what, and was corrected by RTA Constructions once it was requested. PACE asked them after the bids were turned in and reviewed to submit these additional documents. These are the exact same documents that MDS Construction was thrown out for. Let's see, corrected. Okay, but they were allowed to correct those items. The fourth item was the requirement for the qualifications of the electrical contractor. Well, one of the reasons we cut our bid was that the contractor that we use, who has 30 years of experience, but had a $15,000 addition, we felt that their qualifications should meet. However, they did not, according to PACE. PACE stringent requirements and what have you. There was only one contractor, Bullard Electric, that met those qualifications, but he was $15,000 higher. Article 12 of the specification states that if the owner or engineers does not approve or does not want that electrical or subcontractor, that they can require you to substitute them at no additional cost. We agreed to that. We said that's not a problem. We would go ahead and eat the $15,000. RTA.
Can you tell me what
Yes.
is PACE and what is RTA?
RTA is the second bidder.
The second bidder, and PACE,
PACE is the engineers.
the engineers, and they're doing.
They put the bid together. They wrote up the bids, qualifications, and et cetera, the documents for the project.
So they're. Mr. Laufer, have your folks have looked at this?
Essentially, from looking, and just to kind of
And I know
move
we
the
have another
conversation along,
speaker on this in a moment.
my understanding, having reviewed the bid protest resolution, was that PACE essentially was managing the project, if you will, for the CSD and put out the bid package and then evaluated the bids.
Correct.
All right, so they're like, okay, an engineering, consulting engineer.
Yes.
Okay,
Correct. Okay. So the RTA was allowed to remedy their bid after the fact. Now, the Public Contract Code and case law supports the precedence that a bidder cannot be allowed to remedy a defective bid after it is turned in. We ask that your counsel render a decision or what have you. He assumed it was for us. We wanted him to render a decision to your staff and or the board that what it is in fact what they did was improper and or illegal to do. Case precedent has shown that you cannot modify your bid thereafter. MDS Construction was not afforded that opportunity. Why wasn't MDS allowed to initial the errors and submit the thing, those that have never risen to the point for disqualification? So I'm protesting, or I can't imagine that under these circumstances, if they want to throw us out, that's fine, but they should not be allowed, or you should not be allowed to award the project to the second bidder who had the exact same error that we did. We're thrown out for it, and it should not be, the public should not have to spend another $800,000 for the project and receive nothing for that. There's a lot of small communities that would love to have $800,000 to improve their facilities and what have you. I don't know how much money that you guys have to award and what have you, but I'm sure at some point you're going to run out. It's not endless.
Right, sure. I mean, we're not the ones doing the contract awards here, but I'm interested in hearing. I know there's one other speaker that I'm assuming is on the same topic, and then I'm going to turn to Mr. Laufer about
That could be.
how what our ability to review is.
Well,
Yeah, these tend to be, at the local level, but we'll see. So thank you.
okay.
I mean, we obviously can't act in public comment. Mr. Kepper, is it about this? A different, okay.
Good morning. My name is Chris Coper. I'm the General Manager for Shasta Community Services District. I'm here with my Board President, Jan Hanks, Jessica Chandler from Pace Engineering, and also Tom Warnock from Pace Engineering. And first off, I'd like to thank the board for this opportunity to help our distribution system and to provide the funding for our project here. I would also like to apologize for this unfortunate delay. We feel like we've done everything properly, and we're ready to get going. We've been ready to get going on this for the last month, and so we're just trying to get to a point where we can start working. And really, we're just here to answer any questions that you might have.
Well, but we can't take action in a public comment
Sure.
period, and then we have to figure out what the action is. Is there anything you want to share with us in response to what Mr. Steerley said?
I don't want to
That
get...
would be helpful.
Right. I don't feel like the RTA issues were the same as the MDS issues. It seemed like there was a lot more on the MDS side, but just things weren't in order. Last minute things were being thrown on the down on the paper, and it just didn't have a good feel to it. I don't know exactly what you're looking for, but we're here to answer anything you might have.
You have a question?
Well, as the chair said, it's not our role to get it. It really is your role as the district to evaluate the veracity of the bids with respect to the specifications that the engineer put out to bid. And so this is a local matter from my perspective and my experience of over 6 years of doing exactly what PACE is working on right now. So I have that experience. So in my experience, I've seen local districts, rebid when there's anomalies and problems. Are you considering that? And from our perspective, Deputy Director Lawden is in the audience. Is that something problematic for our process of funding?
We discussed putting it out to bid again, and we're concerned that we might not have people that want to bid after this go-around. All the delays and everything that's happened.
Right. Yeah, I'm familiar with that dynamic in terms of having bids, and not then going out to rebid and just getting one bid can be problematic too. So I understand the risks that you're grappling with.
Well, sometimes you get better bids too. I mean, it's hard to know. I don't think we can adjudicate this sitting here. I'm just going to we're going to have to follow up and get the facts and figure it out. I appreciate you have a project you want to get done, but I think we have to run it to ground a little bit at the appropriate level. I can't. I've done a lot of contracting from local government, and there are a lot of rules, and I want to make sure they're
so it's unusual for it to come to us like that.
Well, and I just want to remind the board, in the SRF policies that we have adopted in the past, the board has expressly stated that it does not get involved in bid disputes. What played out here was that you did have a bidder that protested using the process under the Public Contract Code to the appropriate entity, and that is the entity awarding the contract. And you use the turn of phrase adjudicate this matter, and that's not the board's role in this circumstance. Now, there is a very legitimate issue that's being raised by Mr. Sterling, which is the fact that we do have a limited pot of money, and it's not uncommon for for some of these projects to go to a bidder that is not the highest or the lowest bidder.
Yeah.
Your staff are accustomed to working through those issues, but your staff do not go and look at compliance with the public contract code because we don't have the capacity, we don't have the authority to adjudicate it. And so historically, that's why the board has included in the formal adopted policies of the board that it does not get involved in bid disputes amongst the local grantees and their contractors.
One thing I'd like to add is we do have a email string and a letter from our attorney that was given to MDS and plenty of time for them to adjust their bid. So they did have plenty of time to do that.
All right, thank you. I don't have questions I can ask right now because it just sort of hit us this
Thank you.
morning. So follow up with staff. Thank you, Mr. Leffer. That's what I thought. Ms. Yuremavic.
Here to speak to the board about forged government documents and the EPA's collusion and embezzlement of $60 million from the city of Beaumont. Federal EPA laws, Title 40, Section 123, requires state water quality control boards to conduct annual inspection on all major discharge facilities. The board conducted 4 inspections between 2010 and 2016 after they gave the city of Beaumont a permit to discharge recycled water. Every report never evaluated the pre-treatment program. Why? Because the facility does not exist. They stole all the money and they never built the facility. Your government did not report that the money was gone, that the building did not exist. They gave them the permit and they pretended that it was there. It is not possible to inspect a building that does not exist. It is not possible to produce recycled water without the pretreatment program. The money was stolen in 1993. You look at me like that. Did you not know that, Ms. Detmarcus? You cannot produce recycled water without a series of treatments. You can't just stick some old piece of machinery in the ground and call it recycled water. The reason the city of Beaumont has not produced recycled water in 24 years is because they never built the facility. They stole all the money. Period. I have screamed at you people for 3 years. In August of 2016, you faked an investigative order to check their capacity. The 4 inspections that were taken between 2010 and 2016 shows as the population increased in Beaumont, the capacity miraculously decreased. How did that happen? How did the people's population increase, but the water usage decreased? How is that possible? It's not. It is not possible. That's not how life runs. If the state board had ever inspected it, they would know. If they had ever verified a document, they would know. If they had ever looked and used common sense, they would realize that Beaumont is forging their EPA documents. There's just no alternative world. You say that I see things differently, Miss Marcus. I am an accountant. I see things black and white. Money, money, money. That's it. There's no philosophy here. There is no opinion. This is money. Your government agency forged these documents. And in August, you faked having an investigative report on capacity and came up with the conclusion that Beaumont needed to expand and needed to submit another preliminary capacity expansion design, which they already did a year earlier, that the board approved a year earlier. But they approved the same thing 3 years earlier than that. And they approved the same thing 7 years earlier than that. The same documents have been approved over and over and over. Millions of dollars have been funneled out of this city. These people are almost out of water. 2/3 of their water is imported from the state. They don't have money to buy water. They're not wealthy people. They live in the desert. And the buildings are still continuing because the state board refuses to do your job. I have filed complaints with the federal EPA, as you are all aware, because I copied you. I also turned it in to the Attorney General and the FBI. We're going to stand right here and expose everything until I get my indictments. You could drag your heels or you could do your job. That's up to you, but I will get my indictments. Let's see how long the Attorney General can hold off the feds, because I'm guessing they can't. And I asked for those records to prove you forged a Blue Baby scam and drove people out of their businesses, and you have forged EPA reports to drive dairy farmers out of their businesses. I asked for those reports, and you have destroyed those documents, and you can't turn them over. It's been weeks. Where are those reports at, Ms. Marcus? Where are the forged EPA reports that you were so proud of a few months ago? Where are they at now?
Grimovic, we have people trying to respond and talk to you about everything you've raised.
All
When
you
they
got to do is
disagree,
produce
you
documents.
accuse them of lying. It is difficult. We'll keep looking at everything you send, but the fact that we see it differently, I can't help.
You don't
Maybe
see
a
those
third
forged
party will
documents
help.
at all because you've destroyed them. Where are they at? Why are they removed from your website? Why is it when I say, give me that document that proved, you said you used scientific evidence and your staff verified Wildermoose reports. Let me see it. Turn it over so I can turn it over to the feds and the EPA. Where's it at? Put it in my hand. You told me, Miss Marcus, you've been working on it 20 years. You've been working to drive dairy farmers out of business.
I actually did not say that to you.
Oh, I believe you did. You
did
said,
not,
oh, I've
because
been working on that for 20 years.
I know the issue, and there is an issue with dairy farms.
Did you
That's all.
read it? Did you read any of those documents?
No, I haven't read
No,
those
you didn't read the documents.
I did not, but other
You
people.
did not. But you are driving people out of business and you didn't even have the courtesy to read the document? It never occurred to you these people are lying to you? Really? Really? Government corruption never crossed your mind? Really? Really? Really?
Thank you.
Here, Lopper, add this to your collection.
Next, we'll consider adoption of the May 16th board meeting minutes.
So moved.
I'll second.
Any additions or corrections?
Actually, I don't think you can second, Mr. Moore.
Oh, okay.
Do I have another second?
Second.
Now, are there any additions or corrections? All right, all in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
All right, carries.
I think, Mr. Moore, you need to abstain.
Oh, okay, sorry, I was going ahead. I did watch it on the web, the whole thing.
You did, that's true. All right. We have one uncontested item. Are there any questions, or do we have any cards on it? I see supporters in the audience, and I appreciate all the work that went into this. It's very important. Please don't take the fact that it's uncontested and we're going to keep moving as any indication that it's not important. It's very important. So do I have a motion?
So moved with pride.
Good
You had to
work,
be
Seth.
here for an earlier. Sorry. All in favor?
Aye.
All right.
Aye.
Carries. Mr. Lawford, will you introduce item number 3?
Have the Division of Water Rights here to prepare and present on the current hydrologic conditions in the state. And
Thanks, Ken.
Good morning, board members. My name is Kyle Oshindusko. I'm a senior water resource control engineer, and with me today is one of my staffers, Mr. Kenneth Emanuel. We're here today to present item number 3, the hydrology update for the Bay Delta watershed. Oh, forgot all my toys.
We just have you keep doing this because it makes us happy compared to the last 4 years.
Gladly. Alrighty, as we traditionally begin, we look at precipitation across the Sierras, of course, starting in the north. Very little change, if any, from the last time we have record precipitation, as approximately 196% of year to date, or excuse me, of average. Now moving down south in the San Joaquin Basin, precipitation in the five-station index. We are tracking along with historical highs and not setting records, but tracking along very nicely and significantly above average here. Well, gave away the punchline. And in the south in the Tulare Basin, once again, not necessarily setting records for precipitation, but doing outstanding, definitely compared to last year as well as an average. Right now we're approximately looking at 46.1 inches. So we're going to spend a little bit more time on this slide than we typically do. This is a graphical representation of the major man-made reservoirs throughout California. As you can see, most of the reservoirs are filled to capacity, and those that aren't, such as they may be looking for that last drop and talking about unimpaired runoff.
So here now we see it a lot higher because obviously the amount they're allowed to retain has gone up later in the season.
And also, as we see that there's less chance of precipitation, they're looking at snow melt, which I'll get into in later slides. But so then their flood calculations for how they're doing the roll curve and space they're keeping in the reservoir for flood management is also decreasing. So they're trying to, at this point, catch that last drop. And the note on Oroville, hopefully everybody knows at this point they're having some issues with the spillway, and so they're keeping it at a more conservative level at this point. So at a previous board meeting, board member Diadamo asked about how ambient temperatures kind of affect runoff and you know, that whole calculation about when to open floodgates, when to close them, and when to retain water. And so generally, we hear a lot of that discussion revolving around, you know, inflow. And so we rely, and the Department of Water Resources relies on Bulletin 120, which is their estimate for unimpaired runoff for each of the major rivers. And we have 2 illustrative examples to just kind of walk through some of how that may look. Right now, the 50% exceedance level for the runoff for the American River, and this is unimpaired runoff, is estimated to be 695,000 acre feet for the month of June alone. And so if you're thinking about the American River, and you know, there are a lot of things that go into that. You know, there's diversions, and so looking at 695,000 acre feet, that's about 3/4 the capacity of Folsom. And so not to say that, you know, that entire volume of water is coming down, but just kind of showing that as the temperatures start to heat up and that snow melt is coming down, you know, those are the things that the dam operators are really looking at as far as when to open, when to release, and what to plan for in the near future. And so Bulletin 120 is really one of the critical documents that they look at. Excuse me. And similarly, there's a 50% exceedance level at this time for runoff in the Stanislaus River below Goodwin River, and that's estimated at 440,000 acre feet for the month of June. And so New Melones has a capacity of 2.4 million acre feet, and so it takes a little bit more time for that one to fill up as well. So maybe they can, you know, operate a little bit more aggressively or try to retain more based on their anticipated inflow. So once again, Bulletin 120 is, and there's a slide that's going to come in later on to show, you know, how ambient air temperatures and looking at the past kind of go into that inflow calculation and then help reservoir operators do their jobs. And as always, our +2 for Cachuma and Diamond Valley. They're holding steady at about 48% and 87% of capacity respectively.
Can I trouble you to add Lake McClure? The Merced, it's
Not a
another
problem.
more private one. It's not the projects, but it'd be good to know for the Merced River.
Absolutely. Moving on, looking at climatic data for the state and the U.S. Drought Monitor, relatively little change from what we presented about 2 weeks ago. As indicative in the south and on the south central coast, we're seeing a little bit of abnormally dry area, but once again, we're entering into the summer. It's not unexpected. And so here's the snow water content for each of those 3 basins that we highlighted in the beginning. And as we can see that, the numbers are starting to trend downward and following along what we would see historically as far as curve pattern, although the magnitude has changed here. And this is really speaking more towards the real reservoirs of California, the snowpack that we're using, and more as opposed to looking at the man-made reservoirs as holding our water for the year. Moving on to Sacramento River temperature. The Sacramento River Temperature Management Plan has been prepared and submitted for 2017 on or about May 23rd. And the temperature target is 56 degrees at Balls Ferry. And we don't anticipate at this time any problems meeting temperature requirements. The Lake Shasta isothermal baths, it gets me every time, I apologize. So we're seeing a little bit more stratification in the lake. And one note here is that we're about 2 times the volume of historical cold water pool. So we're looking very good. We should, backing up that data that we don't anticipate seeing any issues with temperature management this year. And here's our other new slide, just talking about ambient air temperatures. Where are we this year as compared to last year? So for the picture of California on your left, that's within the last 3 months, how does that data compare to our historical data on record? And the one on the right is within the last 6 months, how does that data compare to historical temperatures in California? Although the scales are different by 1 degree, generally if you see anything pink or if you see anything black, that's a marked departure from normal. And so temperature fluctuations of 1 to 2 degrees, it's a very changing fluid environment where every year you can expect some sort of deviation, but nothing is outstanding or sticks out as abnormal within the temperatures for the last 3 and 6 months as compared to historical average. And so with that concludes my portion of the presentation, but as always, we're here for any questions that the board may have.
At this time of the year, going back a couple of years, this is when we begin to ask questions from the meteorologists about long-range forecasts, queuing things up for next wet season. Is there any general chatter about possible temperature, precipitation forecasts at this time? Because I just remember it was in May.
This is when the El Nino swirls begin, or the La Nina swirls.
That's right. So I'm just interested because it hasn't been as... That's right. It's those predictions aren't necessarily real ironclad. What's the latest you've heard?
Right. So sometimes, forcing climatologists and engineers to present preliminary data or data that they're uncomfortable with without the final stamp or a piece of data that they're looking for is fairly difficult. So at this time,
much hesitance the last few years.
In May.
Would be good.
Yeah, it's June already. People were talking about the El Nino in the May time frame. So
Those are better.
So at this point, we don't have any further information about El Nino, but we'll definitely be working with our federal and state partners to ascertain a little bit more of that information, and we can bring that back at a future board meeting.
Yeah, thanks a lot.
Thank you all for your
That
time.
was great. It was nice to see those different colors on the map. All of the maps, all of the graphs. All right. Item number 5.
So while we reset the deck here, we're now going to hear from the Office of Research, Planning, and Performance with an update on the water conservation
Oh,
regulations.
I'm sorry, I skipped it. Sorry. Oh, there you are. Hi, Elena. Sorry, item number 4. 1, 2, 5. Sorry.
Good morning.
Mind that Ann needed to leave, but not for a while, so. Hi.
Chair Marcus, members of the board, Yelena Hartman from your Office of Research Planning and Performance with a to-the-point quick update on the urban water conservation report with our April 2017 data. Following the plentiful snow and rain this winter, the governor lifted the drought proclamation, which was then followed by the partial rescission of the emergency conservation regulation, which has been in effect for the past few years. And the part that was rescinded and is no longer in place are the state-mandated water conservation targets. We do have a couple of important pieces that remain in place, which is the prohibitions of wasteful water uses, such as irrigating during or immediately after rain. And also the requirement to submit monthly reports of our larger urban water suppliers remains in place. So concluding with April 2017, we have 35 months of water production data. And as 2013 has served as a baseline for water production reductions during the past period, we will continue to show this. April 2017 production was 130 billion gallons, which is down from that baseline, which was 166 billion gallons. We see that the orange line, which is 2017 urban water production, is a slight uptick compared to last year, but still well below the baseline in 2015.
Now, this data is going to be interesting through the summer. See what happens.
That is really what we'll look for. I don't know how many slides I'm going to advance once I do go forward. So the 130 billion gallons, I'm trying to go back.
You want to go
Janine.
back? Yeah.
Yeah, thank you.
There you go. I like these new graphics you've got. Yeah, I know, it's sort of fun.
We're trying something different. I now went forward, the 21.7%, which is the percent savings in April 2017 compared to the 2013 baseline.
That's pretty impressive.
This is really good, yes. And this is with 96% of suppliers reporting. And these are the savings that would be enough water to supply more than 500,000 people with water for 1 year.
I would point out that this is why your sewer capacity ends up going down even when your population goes up.
That is correct. Compared to 2013, in the past couple of years, remember, we have cumulative savings statewide of 22%. So some areas have had more than that and others a little bit less, but yes, you're correct. We have made an effort to reduce the I'm trying to go to the next slide, which shows the statewide average residential gallons per capita per day.
Yeah.
In April 2017, it was 81 gallons. This is a bit up from the 77 gallons per person per day in April of 2016.
But to just go up that much despite all the rain and snow is pretty
yes,
impressive.
It's quite impressive. And in fact, what Kyle is showing, we have to kind of step back in time, a couple of cycles of the hydrologic updates, because we are looking at April. So April, 6 of the hydrologic regions had lower residential use per person than last year. All of the hydrologic regions are doing better than in 2015 and in 2013. We don't have the 2014 data because reporting started in June. But in April, we had this broad warming trend, and so there were quite a few storms in April, but there was an active pattern that kept that precipitation to the northern two-thirds of the state, and non-mountainous region south of Bakersfield missed most of this precipitation. And so when we look at the hydrologic regions that maybe have residential use in April of this year greater than last year, well, those are the areas where there was much less rain, but we do see exactly that correlation with the precipitation. And I'll just quickly say that we are continuing with the monthly reporting, and we will be bringing you back these data. The summaries by each supplier performance in April 2017 are posted online. We have prepared a fact sheet that's also posted, and our full data set since June 2014 is also available on the conservation portal. The Office of Enforcement continues to work with suppliers that are missing more than 2 reports so that we can have this record complete and so that they're in compliance with the reporting requirement. And then, as indicated previously, there will be 2 separate actions to make the prohibitions of the wasteful water uses permanent and then to make the reporting requirement permanent. And that's still on track to be released in the draft form over the summer. So that really completes this conservation update. But if you have any questions now or at any time later, we're really happy to look into new.
When it comes to the non-reporters, how many roughly, and are they of a certain size?
The requirement applies to larger urban water suppliers. So all these urban water suppliers are either 3,000 connections or more, or deliver more than 3,000 acre-feet per year. So these are larger in terms of size. And then this month we had 96% compliance with the reporting requirement, which means there were about 15 suppliers that didn't submit a report. And so sometimes there's a legitimate reason. In fact, we have been in conversation with 2 suppliers where sometimes there are sudden staff departure, and sometimes there is not a sudden staff departure, but in transitioning the roles, sometimes people don't realize this was a monthly thing that needs to be done. And so we're working with those suppliers that are getting started from scratch if they lost a staff person suddenly. And Office of Enforcement has done a really good job in outreaching to people to find out why maybe they're not aware that this requirement is in place. And so a handful of suppliers.
And weren't there, some of them just are on a different cycle, so they come in later each month than our closing period? Weren't there some of those, or are those already taken care of?
There are some that have a different cycle internally, given that our deadline is the 15th of the month for the previous month. So for example, on June 15th, we expect May production reports to be submitted. Suppliers are expected to submit their best estimate. They can at any time revise their reports with the actual information when it comes in, but the requirement is to submit a report on the due date.
Thank you. Thanks for the great work all along. It's really terrific. And now, item number 5.
Now we have item 5, which is a consideration of a proposed resolution to approve Prop 1 drinking water planning grants for the city of Dunsmuir. We're going to have the Division of Financial Assistance and Jennifer Toney, who will introduce any staff that will accompany her.
Good morning, Chair Marcus and members of the board. My name is Julie Rosardo, the Chief of the Office of Sustainable Water Solutions and the Division of Financial Assistance. Here with me today, to my right, Maureen Siddiqui, and to my left, Ann Hartridge. Maureen will be presenting today's item.
Good morning. Item 5 on your agenda today would approve Proposition 1 drinking water planning grant funding to the City of Dunsmuir for the water main replacement project. The City of Dunsmuir is a severely disadvantaged community that serves approximately 1,482 residents and has a median household income of $24,770. The city wishes to assess how to create deficiencies in their distribution system by requesting $500,000 in planning funding to prepare a project report, environmental documents, plans and specifications, and a construction funding application. This project supports the human right to water because it will assist a severely disadvantaged community to obtain safe drinking water by reducing their financing costs and providing the technical assistance needed to assess how to correct deficiencies in the distribution system. Charges have been filed by the Siskiyou County District Attorney's Office against an employee of the city for allegedly failing to report positive findings of bacteria in public water systems. An investigation is being conducted by the Office of Enforcement and Division of Drinking Water. Because the investigation is still pending, the project is not routine. Therefore, we are presenting this project to the board for approval. We are happy to answer questions at this time.
Questions? Have you looked at it? Questions? All right. Well, in looking at this, it's definitely non-routine, and I appreciate that you all have stayed, and this is, given that we have a variety of enforcement actions happening, in one sense, it's not appropriate to ask a bunch of questions here. I think in this case, having spent some time with staff and getting the feedback from the Drinking Water Division and all, it makes sense to move forward on this, but I'm going to want to follow up more. I'll probably work with either Mr. Moore or Ms. Dodek on it, just to understand, because there's a whole passel of things I want to follow up and understand. But in this case, moving forward, I think, is in the best interest of the folks who live in this area. So I don't have an objection, but it's definitely not routine. So it warrants a close look, not just a pass. Do I have a motion?
Move adoption of item 5.
Second?
I'll second the motion.
All right. All in favor?
Aye.
Carries. Thank you all very much. All right. Let's take a 10-minute break before we go to our next item, which would be, if I'm counting correctly today, item number 6. All right. We are back. It is 10:33. Looking forward to this. Item number 6.
Good morning, Chairman Marcus and board members. My name is Chris Vaughan, Environmental Program Manager in the Division of Water Rights. This is an information item on the status of the Bay Delta and Klamath River salmon fishery. Speaking today will be John McManus, to my right, Golden Gate Salmon Association, John Gerber, Moyo Fishing Center, Josh Saxton, Karuk Tribal Councilman, John Copen, Commercial Fisherman, and Dr. Craig Tucker, Karuk Tribal Natural Resources Policy Advocate. With that, I'll turn it over to the Salmon Group.
Morning, folks.
Morning.
I've got a PowerPoint, if you guys can put that up. Chair Marcus, board members, it's good to be back in front of you. You see some familiar faces here today. We have some other members of the salmon community who are probably new to you, and we'll talk about who's here. I'm John McManus, Executive Director of the Golden Gate Salmon Association. We represent sport and commercial salmon fishing interests and related businesses. And what do I point this at? Oh, it worked. Real briefly, John Keppen, who is a commercial troller, with the white shirt on, has come from Monterey Bay today, tied the boat up, even though there are actually a few fish down there, to give a report on how the salmon season's going in the commercial sector. John Giebers, to my immediate right, has come all the way from Fort Bragg to give a report on how the salmon closure on the Mendocino coast and points north is affecting both sport and commercial interests. Josh Saxton has come down from the Klamath Basin to speak on Klamath issues, and as has Craig Tucker. So thank you guys all for coming today. Real briefly, I don't think anybody is unaware that we've got real problems in the salmon fishery right now. We're coming out of a hangover from the drought. You'll notice this is just a couple weeks ago, the headline in the Santa Cruz paper, California salmon facing extinction, report warns. That was a report put out by Cal Trout and others, Dr. Peter Moyle, that looked at long-term trends in California that we'd like to argue are reversible with a little help from our friends. Here's another one, again, real recently, Sacramento Bee, decimated by drought, salmon fishing teeters on the brink in California. And then you might have noticed also about the same time, the governors of both Oregon and California sent a letter to the U.S. Commerce Secretary seeking a disaster declaration, primarily because of failure of Klamath River stocks. And we'll get into that in just a little bit. In that letter that the two governors sent, they said ocean salmon fishery restrictions in our states in 2016 and 2017, including full closures in some areas for 2017, have severe effects on already distressed rural communities and the businesses that depend upon these fisheries. I'd just like to remind that in a healthy season, and we may actually see that next year and the year after because of the rain we got, our industry is valued at about $1.4 billion in annual economic activity and employs at least 23,000 people in California alone. One of the things I want to point at is that the biological opinions that you all hear so much about basically are designed to protect winter and spring run salmon, but they leave the fall run unprotected. The photo here is showing you fall run salmon caught in the commercial salmon fishery. Among the areas where the fall run is being exposed and where we could really use some help has to do with river temperatures in the upper Sacramento after temperature control for winter run expires. In the biop, it expires at October 1. It's been extended in years when winter run spawning has been documented where eggs are still in the gravel beyond October. But basically what's happening is the fall runs start showing up in September. They're laying their eggs in the gravel, and come October and into November, we're seeing river temperatures exceed 56 degrees. We're losing massive amounts of fall run from these excessive temperatures. Another thing that's hurting the fall run that's beyond the protections of the biological opinion is how Shasta is being ramped down after big summertime water deliveries. The fall run, again, are being hurt badly. They're coming into the river, laying their eggs in the shallow gravel. The shallow gravel areas that you've seen basically contain fall run eggs. 24 hours prior to this shot, they were about 2 feet underwater. Now they're high and dry. We're losing massive amount of fall run spawn. If you want to run a water system to kill off the natural fish and leave only hatchery fish, this is the best way to do it. Ramp down rapidly, let your temperatures go into excess after winter run controls expire, and all that's going to be left over is hatchery fish. So as you hear people criticize the hatchery fish in the valley, this is one thing to keep in mind. Just a picture to show you, going from the high flows at Keswick down to the low flows. Hello, slide advance. Leads to a bad situation. This is from 2012. This blue line shows you releases coming out of Keswick, and you'll notice it starts on September 1 up at 10,500 CFS. By December, it's down basically to 4,500 CFS. Now, this is the period of time when the fall run are laying their eggs in the river gravel. So they lay eggs starting in September up in the 9,000 CFS range, and then they get dewatered. And this is not uncommon, unfortunately. Again, another picture showing you fall run reds, the high gravel spots, completely high and dry. If there's something that this body can do to help us, we would very much appreciate it, because we're beyond the purview of the biological opinions here. This is kind of an interesting picture that I just wanted to share, moving to a topic of what's going on in the Sacramento Basin during the spring. This line in the middle that kind of looks like an M that bounces up around the 16,000 CFS shows you what flows were like in the Sacramento before all the dams were built. Put differently, that's kind of your natural hydrograph. And notice that peak flows were basically between January and May. So these Sacramento River fish evolved to take advantage of that great big slug of water in the spring to hitchhike out of the Sacramento Basin and get down to the Delta and out to the ocean. These other lines all show you basically what's happened since dams have come in place. And note that the high water runoff has moved into the summer for agricultural deliveries. Oops. Hang on. Am I pointing at the right thing here? Okay. Here's a similar graphic from the Feather River. That gigantic mountain, the blue line in the middle, shows you what the natural hydrograph looked like back before Oroville Dam was built. And notice your big runoff happened between March and June. The red lines over on the right show you what is happening today. There's very little runoff coming out of there in the spring. Most of it's in the summertime. It's had tragic effects on our salmon in the Sacramento Basin. The Bureau of Reclamation used this as part of a slideshow recently in discussions about reconsultation over the NMFS biop. The only thing I want to point you to on this slide is April flow, the spring flow restrictions. April flow ranges between 4,000 and 8,000 CFS. So that's what they're targeting for the Sacramento River, and what I'm here to tell you is it's actually not enough. Again, if you went back to those other slides, you'd see that flows in the Sac were about twice that historically. And so what ends up happening, you guys have seen this slide before, I've used it in front of this body before, lack of water in the springtime equals much higher predation. And we need your help to get a little bit of flow down that river in the spring to help all of the runs, well, certainly spring run and fall run. I want to point to a study that was done by the NMFS folks that looked at outmigration survival in wet and dry years in California Sacramento Valley. Basically what it found is we're losing massive volumes of fish in the Sacramento River proper long before they ever get to the Delta because of low spring flows. And here's something I just got from a researcher who's working on spring run over on Mill Creek. This hasn't been published yet. You can see it's from 2016. Basically what they're showing you is they tagged 23 fish over in Mill Creek and they let them go, and they watch what happened to those fish as they went downstream, and they lose one or two in the creek, but you see they basically lose them all once they hit the Sacramento River. You can see a point there, it's Mill Creek confluence, the confluence with the Sacramento River at River Mile 441. That's where they hit the Sac. They persist a little longer, and by the time they're down to a place called Irvine Finch, we've lost them all. And here's a map showing you basically where Mill Creek comes into the Sac, and Irvine Finch is down near Hamilton City. In 46 miles of river, we're losing all those fish. And again, it's because we don't have enough flow in this river in the springtime. I want to cover another point, just to point out that the biological opinion is not strong enough. I think what we saw during the drought pretty much proves that. That's why they're reinitiating consultation. NIMS is moving to strengthen cold water requirements, and I'd like to posit they could use the support of this body in their efforts here. Delta Water Quality Standards update. You guys are deep in it right now. We consider it critical, because as UC Davis found, California has given away rights to far more water than it has by about 5 times. We desperately need your help to balance this or rebalance this. Quickly, I'm going to move over to one of my pet peeves. You've heard it before, so I'll hit and run. This is over on the Feather River, and you're looking at basically the Thermalito complex downstream of the dam. I just want to remind that they're shunting quite a bit of water through that big square cornered lake, which is a shallow water heating pond. And when they release it back into the Feather River, which is in this photo at the Thermalito outlet, that water is hot. It's hot. Under the FERC relicensing of that dam, which is not final yet, when it is finalized, DWR has sworn that they will address this problem. But in the meantime, it's killing our salmon in not only the Feather River, but by the time this thing flows down and combines with the Sacramento River at Verona, it's creating elevated water temperatures all the way down to the Delta, which is impeding adult spring run trying to get up the river to spawn. This map shows you basically from the outlet at River Mile 59 all the way down to Yuba City. We've got otherwise good salmon habitat, which is simply too hot. So to the extent this body can help us press DWR to fix this problem soonest, that would be most appreciated. And again, that's where it stems from. So I want to wrap up and just say that we're recommending a few actions today. We need to end fall run dewatering below Shasta Dam. It's absolutely devastating to the fall run. We believe that we need to provide spring outmigration flows in the Sac, and we encourage the process underway on the updating of the Delta standards. My personal belief is we're going to need your action to prompt where we need to get to. I'm skeptical about the settlement negotiations, hopeful, but not holding my breath, and I think we're going to need your help. On the protective temperatures, we need to accelerate the Thermalito After Bay retrofit. They know how to fix the problem, they just need to do it. And we need to ensure protective temperatures for the fall run spawning below Shasta Dam. One of my favorite pictures, you've seen this before. My colleague Jacob Katz actually shot this. This is down in the Yola Bypass. For anybody who was just down there looking at the Wallace Weir project, this was taken right below where that fish trap is now in place, and this was shot before those facilities were put in place. I will leave it there and toss to my good friend and colleague, Mr. John Giebers, who's coming out of Fort Bragg.
Thank you, John.
Oh yeah, pull it a little closer to make sure the green light's on.
Thank you, John. Thank you. I'm John Gabers. My wife Susan and I have Noyo Fishing Center. We're owner-operators of that facility in the harbor at Fort Bragg. Normally, on a normal year, about 60% of our gross sales is salmon related, directly salmon related. Typically this time of year, I'd open the shop about 5:30 in the morning. Susan would come in about 6 to help me open the door, and we'd have quite a few anglers, early birds, getting ready to head out the harbor and do their salmon fishing. We tried to get it going because after the first hour, we knew at about 7:05 to 7:10, there'd be 15 to 25 workers from the fish processing plant down the work coming into the shop to get their hot coffee with lots of sugar and their roll, which was their dinner or lunch, I guess. They call it bread. We couldn't communicate very well, but smiles go a long ways. Some days, if it wasn't too busy, when the ladies come up and give me their $2 for their coffee and their bread, I'll get their hands because they like it. They've been just working in slush for the last 8 hours. They've just finished a shift, an 8-hour shift, and they're getting warmed up and they're getting ready to go to their next job, another 8-hour shift. They're not there this year. Neither are the salmon fishermen. My wife's there holding down the fort for me, but the fishermen aren't there. My wife and I are lucky. We own the building. After the last time something similar to this happened in 2008, we made some plans. We started sandbagging for this over a year ago. We could see this coming. I think we could all see this coming. Well, this year, we haven't collected rent so far. We haven't taken a paycheck so far. But we're going to hang in there. We're old and we're tough. The thing that hurts the most for me, just over a year ago, my daughter called me. She's an Army medic. She was thinking about re-enlisting. I'd always hoped that she would take over the store. I couldn't ask her back. So she did. Hopefully this year she'll get into med school with them. If not, she's on her way back to Iraq. That's a personal story. 4 weeks ago, a good friend of mine, Randy Thornton, he's been a charter boat captain, owned his own boat for over 15 years. Life is tough in the harbor. He couldn't afford life insurance. He couldn't afford even medical insurance. One of his few trips that he had for salmon fishing this year, he was loading up his passengers on the boat, had a stroke. He didn't come out. So his family's left behind. It's a great place to work. It's a great place to live there in the harbor, but it's awful tough without any salmon around. On Thursday and Friday this last week, the fifth graders, we only have one elementary school in Fort Bragg, the fifth graders came through for their annual harbor tour. They came in the shop and I gave them some information, talked a little bit about salmon. My assistant Marley and I took them across the street where the fish processor is. Obviously no salmon, but her uncle happened to be there offloading black cod. That's all he could get, and not many of them. The limit's pretty small on those. So the kids watched those, watched them get packed up. Marley's dad leaves this morning, actually already left, to go up to Newport, Oregon, and try to scratch out some salmon before crab season opens up next fall, so they could make it. It's a tough life. We'll hang in there, but I don't know if the kids can make it. We're trying to keep them. Fort Bragg's a great place, but it's a very hard place to make a living these days. I didn't come here to waste my time. I drove here 4 hours. I didn't come here to waste your time. I don't know a lot. I haven't been here before, but I did read your history. I did read about you folks. And you know what? I grew up in the 50s and 60s in the Santa Clara Valley. Back then, I went on a field trip to a water treatment plant, and you know what they told me? Someday we hope that this water is going to be clean enough to drink. You guys did it. The bay could have been a cesspool. You, with the agencies, turned it around, turned the corner, and look what we've got. Look at our coastal streams and our coastal rivers. Where I am, the Noyo River used to be trashed when they had the lumber going. Now it's pristine as far as I'm concerned. Yesterday I took a trip up the river in a kayak. I counted 5 river otters, among a lot of other life. You've done your job. I just wish you the best to move on and get our system healthy. Thank you so much.
My name is John Kepin. I'm not sure how this works. I see this button.
Yeah, and then you
I'm not
pull it
used to
towards you,
pushing
you don't have
buttons.
to lean forward.
My name's John Kepin. I'm a commercial salmon fisherman. I've had 3 days of 4 in the morning till 9 in the afternoon, so I've written down my presentation because this is a rare opportunity for my people, and I don't want to miss anything. As I said, I'm the owner-operator of the fishing vessel Lulu. It's a 40-foot steel vessel, and it's dedicated to harvesting California king salmon. I have 25-plus years experience in the salmon fishing industry. And I started, as most people do, as a deckhand and worked my way up till I bought the Lulu, which, as a side note, is my daughter's nickname when she was small. And we don't use that any longer. When California Fish and Game instituted limited entry salmon permits around 1988, there were over 5,000 permits issued. 10 years ago, there were 1,400 permits reauthorized, and last year there were 1,098 permits that remained in reauthorization. Of those 2,016 permits, 437 boats made a landing, and 61 vessels caught 50% of the fish, salmon. Compared to 2007, a little over about 10 years before, 601 boats made landings, and 95% of the boats caught 50% of the fish. 50% of the fish being caught is a Fish and Wildlife benchmark. These numbers tell a tale. It tells a tale of the salmon fleet decline, which parallels that of the salmon population in California. The fleet's composition has changed. Fish and Wildlife traditionally considered a salmon trawler as a vessel of 35 feet or greater. Today, fewer than half of the fleet meets that standard. It's primarily composed of 25-foot skiffs that are geared for day fishing. Few active vessels have the ability to trip fish for 5 to 6 days, anchor wherever is convenient, and fish it whatever weather there may be. What is the effect on salmon fishing? That's a question. What is the effect? I will speak only for those 35-foot vessels or greater, which land the bulk of the commercially caught salmon in California. We had most of those vessels, all of those vessels have had to try to find other sources of income. Roughly 60% of the salmon fleet fish crab. With the drastic reduction in the 2017 and in the 16 salmon season, fewer than 10 vessels with both permits are fishing salmon so far this year. What remains are people like me, and there's only a handful of us, and I'm not counting my thumb, that are actually dedicated to fishing salmon. Most of the crab salmon vessels continue to fish crab and into the salmon season. I know what's next, but I got to read it. The extension of the crab effort during the salmon season means more crab pot interactions. Historically, crab pots were stacked and stored in preparation for salmon season, and few crab pots remain for salmon fishermen to become entangled. Today, the loss of fishing gear can cost over $1,000 in entanglement. And I had one of those engagements a couple of weeks ago. It caught 3 crab pots, and it cost me days on the water of lost production and over $1,000. And not only does that affect the salmon fishermen, but it affects the crab fishermen. They lose their gear as well. At one point last year, the ice machines, oops, wrong paragraph, often the crab fishermen, our infrastructure is declining and in some ports gone. There are literally thousands of jobs that have been lost that at once provided services to support healthy and vibrant salmon fleet. At one point last year, you'll know this, the ice machines in Fort Bragg, Bodega Bay, and Half Moon Bay were all down on the same day. We're losing the infrastructure. Today, we work with salmon season structure that prevents the fleet from working traditional migration routes that either protect Sacramento winter run or Klamath Trinity fall run Chinook salmon. On the first day of this season, it's a fishing report, on the first day of this year's season, fewer than 20 traditional salmon trawlers were fishing Monterey Bay. I have to add that by NIMS guidance, I'm choosing my words, by NIMS guidance, we could not fish south or north of Pigeon Point until after June, and that was to protect the winter run fall Chinooks. So we had all your effort, all your salmon trolling effort commercially below Pigeon Point. And fewer than 20 boats, traditional salmon boats, were fishing that area. There were some, on the first day, there were some 50 to 80 fish scores. By the end of the week, there were some scores that approximated 100 fish. By the second week, we were down to 20 fish for the week, and by the third week, all the boats from Fort Bragg were already gone home. The 2 boats from Eureka had gone home. The Bodega boats, there's 4 boats left, and 3 of them haven't even left the dock in the last 2 weeks. And all the Half Moon Bay boats have left and gone home. I took a census yesterday. I was on the water yesterday. There were 12 boats, 35 feet or greater on the water fishing in Monterey Bay. That, in years past when there were fish, it would be a fleet of 100 boats. So the magnitude is quite astounding. Today we work with a salmon structure that prevents the fleet from working traditional migration routes. I did that. The lost investments, this is kind of hits home for me. The lost investments in futures. A vessel with a salmon permit is no longer marketable. It has become a lost investment. Those who bank on their investment in salmon fishing have nothing to fall back on. This is not a disaster. This is total collapse. The salmon can come back, as John has pointed out. The salmon can come back with clean, cold water at critical times of the year and good ocean conditions. The fleet cannot be reconstituted. It cannot attract new numbers of recruits that need to sustain the industry. And with that loss, the job for selling fishing gear, ice, fuel, groceries, and in some cases, the identity of an entire community like Fort Bragg, Bodega Bay, Eureka, and Crescent City are lost as well. The decisions on where and when water will flow are not about fish versus food. They are about lifestyles, passionate pursuits of vocations, families, and communities. I believe with good water and fish management, the salmon will return. I hope I have the opportunity to pass on my knowledge to the next generation. I wish this board appreciates the difficult decisions you're charged to make. You'll have a lasting impact, my apology, on coastal communities and the families who live there, and every California resident will have the opportunity to enjoy California wild troll-caught salmon at a reasonable price. Thank you.
Yuki,
Nanethwe Josh Saxon. Good morning. My name is Josh Saxon. I'm a council member for the Kaduk tribe. First of all, thank you, board, for giving us some time. Thank you to this Golden Gate Salmon Association for being partners with us. I also like to thank the board for their partnership as well with the KBRA and the big push for dam removal on the Klamath Basin. It's our number one goal in terms of how to fix this problem. I have 4 children aged 11 to 5, and thank God they all look like their mother. I think in terms of what I want to focus on, it's a heavy topic for me. I think I'm going to focus on some cultural aspects of these fish and what they mean to us as a tribe, as tribal people, and to me as a traditional fisherman. Also hoping to pass on some of our knowledge to my children and grandchildren. This is where we're at in terms of our tribe. Kaduk territory is the red outline there. We dive into Oregon a little bit, but we take up a pretty good portion of the Mid-Klamath Basin. So this is our historical runs of fish in the Klamath River that we as a people have fished for since the beginning of time. And at this point, we have some question marks up here as to where there's still some information that we need on lamprey and sturgeon. There's some questions about our fall Chinook runs, and I don't know what happened to the other one, but there's a lot of I don't know if I've got, some of these are no longer in the system. Pink salmon, chum salmon, candlefish, these are no longer a part of our system. They've been exterminated through lots of impacts to them, negative impacts to them over the years. And we have summer steelhead, spring Chinook in dire need of conservation at this point. They're in such low numbers. And I think this kind of outlines some of the legacy issues that these fish have been struggling with. Dams, poor land management, unregulated groundwater. This is a photo of the Scott River. Gold mining impacts and irrigation diversions. And as a previous director of the Salmon River Restoration Council, this mining and logging legacy has a huge impact on the Salmon River in particular, and we've been struggling to restore that system, and it's been very, very difficult in terms of how it's been channelized through hydraulic mining in the past and the sediment issues with all the logging, legacy logging that's gone on in that system. It's very evident there because it's not a huge system, so you can really see the impacts. So this is, these photos are, the black and white photo on your left was taken in the early 1900s, and this is a more recent photo here. These are our traditional methods of fishing, and this is a dip net fishery. So this fishery is done at one place. It's called Ishipishi Falls, Katamine, Upper Katamine, Lower Katamine. And this is right near our center of the world. This is where we believe we came from. And these are our responsibilities to salmon and to these fish. Is we believe that this is our existence is not just happenstance. We believe that we have a responsibility to everything, and we are connected to everything. And our responsibility, that agreement that was made in the Great Transformation, was that we would that salmon would provide for us, and we would take care of them. And in the numbers that we're seeing coming back this year, we've limited this fishery to only 200 fish, only for ceremonies and for elders. It's the first time we've ever had to do this. And like was echoed previously, we're in I think uncharted territory in terms of disasters, in terms of I think all the words that are English words that are being used are not enough. as to describe the kind of situation we're in. This is a picture of a white deerskin dance, and this is our white deerskin dance year. We only do this dance every 2 years. We're in addition to being a tribal leader and a tribal fisherman, I'm also a tribal leader in ceremonies and in Pikauish, which is what we call Pikauish ceremony. We do Pikauish every year, and Pikauish loosely translates to fix the world. And we believe that when we do these dances, this is part of our responsibility to our ancestors, to the people that have gone before, and it's a reminder to us that we have a responsibility to this place. And I think in terms of how important fish are to these ceremonies, it's so interconnected that you can't separate them. And to deny access to our fish based on all of these, not just legacy issues, but issues that are going on right now, I think is important to understand that and while we have respect for our partners' economic woes, these are human being identity issues that are plaguing us. It's not just economics. We don't have a fallback plan. There is no fallback plan. This is our identity. We've had commissioned several studies in terms of how this lack of fish has impacted our diet. And in my role as a council member, I'm every month reviewing health statistics, and I'm also sit on the National Institutes of Health Tribal Advisory Committee, and it's the impact of loss of traditional diet across the country is astounding, and the negative impact is seen across the board in terms of what we're offered to eat and the difference between what we're offered to eat and what is available to us from stores versus what traditionally we would get from our forest lands and rivers. So again, to reiterate, this is, obviously the Water Board has several ways that that they can positively impact salmon populations in terms of, in terms of as far as California's dealing with the marijuana industry right now and its impacts on waterways and diversions and water quality and quantity. I think in terms of how specifically the Water Board can help us, I'm going to, at this time, turn it over to Mr. Craig Tucker, who is our Natural Resources Policy Advocate. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Well, Chairwoman, members of the board, I appreciate being here, and it's a real privilege to be on a panel with all these guys. I had the privilege of speaking on a panel with them to the legislature a couple weeks ago, but and I do really, it is remarkable. I feel like there was a time when everybody sort of fought over pieces of a shrinking pie, but I would say commercial fishermen and recreational fishermen and tribal fishermen have worked really hard over years to build a strong coalition and work together, and ideas make the pie bigger. And so I really commend everybody who, has decided to commit to collaboration in solving these problems. I want to talk about a few things, and I hopefully will sort of end this on a positive note, because I do have quite a bit of optimism for the future of Klamath River salmon. And I'm going to focus, and there's a lot that goes on, and as Councilmember Saxon pointed out, our fish are really dying a death by 1,000 cuts. And so I can't go over it all here in the time allotted. But I want to sort of drill down on a couple of places where I think this board can really help. As you all know, we are really committed to removing dams on the Klamath River. I'm very pleased with the contribution that the State Water Board and your staff has made on this effort through the 401 permitting process. I think it's going well, and I'm happy to talk more about that later if you're interested. We continue to fight with the United States Bureau of Reclamation over flows on the main stem river, but some recent litigation has improved flow conditions on the main stem river. But where salmon really do their business is in the tributaries. And you have to have tributaries that support spawning and rearing. And on the Klamath, not all tributaries are created equal. And on the Klamath, the Scott and the Shasta subbasins are phenomenally important, and I would refer to them as sort of cornerstones to the Klamath Basin fishery. And we are slowly dismantling those fisheries. Both ESA-listed coho as well as Chinook salmon are just plummeting. And if you guys have ever been up to the Shasta River, this statistic always blows me away, where in 1932, Snyder reported 80,000 adults returning to the Shasta. And, you know, it's not that big of a river, but it has all these outstanding features and cold water springs that sort of allow it to accommodate this kind of run of fish. So we know what these systems are capable of. I think one of the key things we have to do, the Scott and the Shasta are both fully adjudicated basins. And unfortunately, the adjudications are really flawed. And I hope you can see better on your screen than computer screens than you can see on the projector here. But what I'm trying to demonstrate, these are Google Earth shots of the Scott Valley in 2012 and 2014. So we have a relatively wet year and a very dry year. And what you'll see from the cropping patterns is there's really no difference. And the graphs below show you, in the blue line is precipitation, and the red line is economic value of all field crops and the price per ton for alfalfa. And the point I'm making here is in 2014, when everybody had to suffer through a drought, when the tribe had to suffer through fishing restrictions, when this year our salmon fishermen can't go out and fish because 2014 is when the fish that these guys would be catching now were juveniles. No one in the Scott Valley was suffering. They were making bank. And they actually profited from the drought, where a lot of irrigation districts around the state had to cut back on water because of illegal groundwater pumping. They did not have to do that on the Scott. This is a shot of salmon at the mouth of the Scott River, waiting for the opportunity to move. This is a very dangerous situation. You guys are familiar with the 2002 fish kill. Well, when adult salmon get stuck schooling around in warm water like this, these are the conditions that give rise to these fish diseases that cause catastrophic fish kills. I want to talk a little bit about the Scott adjudication. The Crook tribe has invested quite heavily in understanding the hydrology of the Scott Basin. This is the Scott Valley, and what you'll see, the yellow area is the area of the adjudication from 1980. All those dots surrounding it are groundwater wells that have been drilled since the adjudication. So what the adjudications assumed was any groundwater pumping within this yellow area there's limitations on how much water people can take from those wells. But beyond that area, there's really no regulation on groundwater pumping. And what we know from our analysis and what we know from the analysis of Dr. Harder at UC Davis is that this is this basin is basically a bathtub full of gravel, and all this groundwater is connected to surface flows. And we have some pretty good ideas about that connection and how steps you could take to manage groundwater in better ways. Currently, Siskiyou County is putting together its groundwater management agency. We have requested a consultation with Siskiyou County to participate, and they simply refuse to correspond with us on the matter. The consequences of this groundwater pumping, one way to look at it is the number of days in a calendar year that the flow of the Scott River drops below 40 CFS. And as you can see, since the 1980 adjudication, the number of days that the flows in the Scott dip below this threshold level has gone up significantly. But I think California really has a lot of the regulatory tools to address this situation. A few things coming up for the Water Board. There will be a decision made soon about suction dredge mining. As you all know, the Crook tribe has been battling with recreational gold miners for 15 years now, I think. And we recently advocated and passed legislation here in the state that gave the required miners to get some sort of permit from the Water Board to demonstrate that their activity complied with the Federal Clean Water Act. So right now, the Water Board is sort of contemplating how or if it would actually permit this activity. And I would just point out numerous letters over time to both the Department of Fish and Wildlife, who permits this activity, and to the legislature. Water Board staff have argued that this activity cannot be done in a way that's compliant with the Clean Water Act. Fish and Game Code 5937 is the best law that's rarely used. 5937 basically says if there is a dam or diversion, you have to leave enough water behind to keep fish, quote, in good condition. We think that the department and the water board should find a way to have a program so that any 1602 agreements include a bypass flow that complies with the 5937. Very few 1602 agreements in this state have a bypass flow requirement. We think in places like the Scott, we needed to establish a flow objective in the basin plan. This basically creates a legal obligation to maintain a certain flow in the river. And there are, in the Scott and in the Shasta, there's quite a bit of scientific analysis. We don't have to wait for the next data set or the next study. We have data in hand that can be used to do this. And then revisiting adjudicated basins. So those are the big pieces of my talk. But like I say, I am really optimistic. I do think dam removal on the Klamath is on track. I do think main stem flows are improving. But as Mr. McManus was talking about the Sacramento, we really struggle with single species management. So some species gets listed. On the Sacramento, it's winter run Chinook. On the Klamath, it's coho salmon. So the biological opinions revolve around this single listed species, and what you see is these other species, like fall run Chinook, are sort of, it's just assumed that they'll do well under this flow regime. But we really do need to start thinking about managing our fisheries as sort of an ecosystem management instead of single species management.
Questions? Comments?
Thank you for the presentation. All of you provided, a different aspect of this important issue. I have a question, and I should know the answer to this, so Mr. or Dr. Tucker or maybe Mr. Loeffler, on interconnectivity. So I know that there's a lag in the groundwater legislation as far as when the interconnectivity section takes effect, but how does that relate in adjudicated basins?
Well, and that's one of the challenges with SGMA is generally SGMA does not apply to an adjudicated basin, and the Scott and River adjudication is one of those that would not be subject to SGMA. Of course, most of the debate and discussion over the Scott adjudication is whether or not the boundaries are correct, is what you indicated. And so it's once we get to the groundwater sustainability planning process, as opposed to the GSA formation, that the plan has to take account of interconnectivity and the impacts on interconnected stream waters. So, we're looking 10 years out into the SGMA process as the GSPs are being put together, and that's where there will be an opportunity to begin evaluating. And of course, we've heard from Mr. Tucker and others, some of the challenges that they're facing in terms of the coordination with the fledgling GSA in that area.
I would just add that the one unique feature of the Scott is legal. It's the only river I know of in California where in the water code it states unequivocally that groundwater and surface flows are interconnected, which is why it's sort of been held up as a test case for litigation from PCFFA and Environmental Law Foundation, where they're basically trying to use the public trust doctrine to obligate the regulation of groundwater in the Scott Valley. So I think that litigation is probably going to get to the nut of this issue more quickly than the Groundwater Sustainability Act.
Mm. And then could you comment on some of the cooperative, maybe voluntary efforts that some have undertaken on groundwater recharge? I know the local Farm Bureau, and I'm not recalling what NGO, but I believe there was an effort on the Scott for groundwater recharge.
So the landowners and the county and UC Davis have been doing similar to what we have, engineering analysis, trying to understand how groundwater moves through the valley and connects with surface flows. And so once if you know more about it, well, what could you do? And so with the Crook tribe's support and the support of some other Klamath Riverkeeper and others, last year, landowners tried basically a groundwater recharge experiment. So they took irrigation canals that are used in the summertime and they charged them full of water in the winter. And asking the question is, well, do we recharge groundwater more quickly, and do we see a return of flows back to the river? We think the result of that study is that the help is incredibly modest, and it's not really getting to the problem, which is having enough water in the river July and August and September. So they were going to try it again this year. We were actually opposing continuing. We felt like they were kind of barking up the wrong tree, that there's some other mechanisms to get at this problem that might actually work. But it was sort of became a moot point because it never stopped raining. And so I think all those canals are probably full of water most of the winter anyway this year. But we do think people are starting to get pointed in the right direction. And I think, when you turn on pumps in this geographic area of the valley, we think you could pump from places distant from the river to the river in mid and late summer. And we have a technical memo from our engineers kind of talking about that. So we do think there are some technical solutions to the problem, but it's really hard for me to really, I think there's going to have to be addressing the number of acres being farmed and the number of cuts of alfalfa. I think it's going to be a little bit of everything that's the solution. So I think it's going to be conservation, groundwater management, but also the way they manage crops and crop rotations.
Thank you. Thanks very much to the panel and traveling far away and giving these different perspectives that are very important and describing the community connection with the resource and an important thing for all Californians to remember about this challenge of sustainable fisheries as having a significant cultural component across many cultures in our state, but very much part of a human identity and families and communities. And so I think you did a great job of communicating that aspect and how it does connect the coastal fabric to the valley fabric and the mountain fabric of our state. We are all connected, and you've helped describe that truth, that reality of our connectivity, and laid forth the challenge to all of us to really accept that as part of the challenge. It is growing food, and it is cultivating sustainable water systems that in both of those frames of mind keep things going for all Californians. And we can't do one and not the other. So thank you for communicating that. And then as we get into solutions where we set aside ideological differences, groups that we think we need to belong to and we can't accept the other group's challenges. There's been a lot of great work being done, and you all have been part of this. In the North Coast, it's a great place to start because there is a lot of water. And as we grapple with the difficulties of the water rights system and riparian rights versus appropriative rights, we've been made aware of some great little pilots here in different watersheds where landowners, fishery interests get together and cooperate on doing off-stream storage when the water's coming and not having deleterious effects on the summer flows, which you described in the case of the Scott. So are there some opportunities that you've identified working with folks from different perspectives? And is this an area, I know Trout Unlimited has played a great role in doing this and breaking down the barriers, getting calls back from the other side of the story. Have you had a chance to participate in some watershed-specific projects with folks from the agricultural community or the timber community?
Well, I can talk a little bit. The Crook tribe, one of the features of our rivers that we've lost that contribute to the decline in salmon is our floodplain habitat. So every time there's a flood, the response is to build dikes and levees and constrain our rivers. But where a lot of these fish rear, including coho salmon, tends to be in these slack water habitats that are on in the floodplain. So we have been trying to restore some of these kinds of habitat. We call them off-channel ponds. But there's a technique for building these things. You want groundwater to come into these ponds. You want to have connections to the main stem river that's ephemeral from these ponds. And what we go out there, and there will be, hundreds of thousands of coho salmon in these things. And so we've built private partnerships with landowners in places like Syed Valley to build a suite of these ponds. The other thing that we could do is let beavers do their thing. Like Scott Valley used to be called Beaver Valley. And the whole, it flooded, the whole valley flooded in the winter.
Nature's engineer.
So, yeah. So, I mean, we appreciate that, you can't just let, you can't flood everything back exactly the way it was. But we do think we need to have some means to enter into partnerships with landowners to allow beavers to do their thing and not give out depredation permits as readily as the department often does. So I do think there's some things that we could do to let nature run its course. But for us, we've had this success in places like Syed Valley, but it's tough sledding for us in places like the Scott and the Shasta. They don't want us there. They act like we don't have a right to be there. And, these places are outside of Karuk's Aboriginal territory, but that's where the fish that Karuk catch at Ishipishy Falls are born and raised. And so we do have a vested interest in these places, but it's frankly been very difficult to have landowners in those places accept the fact that we deserve a seat at the table.
I respect that. That's very difficult. One area where the Department of Fish and Wildlife and ourselves under the California Water Action Plan, through the Governor's Action Plan, has designated a few streams around the state to work through some of these challenging areas about answering the question based on science, what is needed in terms of public trust flows. And the Shasta River was selected as part of that. Have you had a chance to participate in that?
Well,
Working with our Division of Water Rights, Regional Water Quality Control Board, et cetera?
Well, the biggest thing that's going on in the Shasta is it's becoming a test case for using safe harbor provisions of the Endangered Species Act to provide a mechanism for landowners to have ESA coverage. And we've been excluded. We've asked to be a part of this. We've written landowners. We've talked to landowners. We've gone to the agencies. The agencies will consult with us at a separate table. But because everyone, including California Department of Fish and Game, has agreed to sign non-disclosure agreements, there's a limit to how much information we can even get about the process. So, we think we have demonstrated on the Klamath, we're good partners. We've solved big problems on the Klamath, negotiated dam removal agreements with multinational energy corporations. We have some of the, I think our biologists are some of the best in the basin for understanding restoration biology, but we keep getting denied a seat at the table for some of these processes.
And finally, on your last slide, you talked about, things the state could do in re-adjudicating an over-appropriated basin. And, we recognize the Scott River system is a challenge, but it seems like it's a solvable challenge if folks collaborate and get together and get what they need to keep their families and communities going on all sides of this issue, whether it's in agriculture or in the fisheries. And we're bringing scientific insight into that. UC Davis is doing some work. Dr. Harder has provided, trying to create light to reduce heat. But I guess this is kind of a question to our Division of Water Rights or Chief Counsel Laufer, or Acting Executive Officer, Chief Counsel Laufer, about re-adjudicating an over-appropriated subbasin. I mean, how does that become initiated? Is it from the outside? Is it on our own motion? Obviously, this would be a very strong, or it would be viewed, it would have a powerful effect for the board to initiate something. But how could this process get going to foster collaboration and solutions that we know exist out there? It just requires us all to set aside the history and work on the problem and the challenge.
Yeah, I think over the last decade at least that I can think of, there's been an effort by the board to kind of walk a fine line to encourage some of those solutions. Clearly from the stakeholders we have here today, those have not borne the fruit that they would have liked to have seen, and I think that the board would like to have seen. In terms of actually reopening the adjudication, the board, although it served in a reference function, as I recall, in the adjudication, the board is not a party to it. And so the procedures that we would need to use are not clear-cut in terms of a clear line about the board's authority to step in and reopen. I think the better argument is the board could drive that kind of exercise. Typically, it would be the parties to the adjudication. There are issues because of some of the boundary issues with respect to the wells that could provide an avenue to trigger a new process. At the same time, you heard Mr. Tucker refer to the ongoing litigation to which the board is actually a nominal defendant with respect to the public trust proceeding, where primarily at this point in time, you have the plaintiffs arguing that Siskiyou County should begin a permitting program for the wells that takes account, for groundwater wells outside of the adjudication basin that takes account of the public trust impacts within the Scott River itself. And so, that provides yet another opportunity down the road, as Mr. Tucker indicated, to get additional water into the system. I won't say within the confines of the existing adjudication, but within some of the framework associated with it.
I appreciate the discussion, because when we see the list, it's like, well, state, just get busy and start doing that. There is a way to go about it. And I think, I only speak for myself, but it will be very important, I think, for the Water Board to approach this to foster collaboration and science-based solutions. And really, a menu of options for the landowners to say, look, this time of year, if you can back off here, we get these off-stream pools, we get the production, and then you get all the water you need at another time of the year. And really work the deal in a collaborative way, so you have a strong agricultural economy as well as a recovered fishery.
And the one thing I do want to add, just because it might have been unclear as I was speaking, when I talk about reopening, I mean, this is not a board adjudication. I mean, this is the court, and so it would be a matter going back to the court and convincing the court that it should do so.
Which I would add, one of the issues there is having a flow objective established by the Water Board that the court would have to pay attention to. And about 3 or 4 weeks ago, finally, after quite a bit of advocacy on some of our parts, the department released an interim flow recommendations for the Scott River. And so we were going to take that to the board, and we think that we'll start with the regional board, but we think that document should serve to inform the development of a flow objective. And I think that starts putting us down this pathway of being able to re-adjudicate the Scott. And what we hope is that landowners, instead of suffering through an adjudication, might take, I don't know, the Klamath adjudication took 37 years. I don't know how long this one would take. But instead of suffering through that, that should be the call to set the table, to sit down and have an honest discussion about what's a just and fair, equitable way to share limited water resources, which is a conversation that to date, neither Siskiyou County nor the landowners in the Scott Valley have been willing to do with us.
Right. Thank you. That actually crystallizes a potential path, and it relates to a lot of what we're working on. Staff here in the room are working on those issues, technical, science-based. And again, just thank you to the panel. A lot of insight also into the dynamics of what sustainable fishery economy means, in terms of the crab and the salmon seasons and the interactions, the number of boats, the severe issues that you're encountering this year, different than ever before. This is a story that must be heard, and thank you for bringing it in a very clear, stark way, really compelling us to think of what actions we can take collectively to slowly build it back up again. Thank you.
Thank you, Steve. That was great. Go ahead.
Definitely cannot match the vice chair's rhetorical skills, but I will just add my thanks to those of his, as well as Board Member Diadamos, for your being here today and for your experience and bringing that experience to us. I do have a question for John McManus. I think must have been 4 or 5 years ago now, was when the Golden Gate Salmon Association first, at least met with me anyway, with respect to your salmon rebuilding plan, I think it was called. And at the time, there were 20-something and 25 or so different projects that you were proposing to look at various aspects of survival, predation, and I was wondering if you can provide us a short update on where you are with those efforts, and to the extent that any lessons learned from those projects could be applied as we look at the water quality control plan update and looking at some of the non-flow measures that might be incorporated.
Thank you for that. Of the projects that we called for in the salmon rebuilding plan, several have been executed primarily by agricultural interests in the Sac Valley, to their credit. Some in partnership with us, some by themselves. The Wallace Weir project was one that we called for. Although we called for the very next step, which is notching the Fremont Weir, which is the really crucial piece there. That Wallace Weir business is to misdirected adults, but what we really need is something like what we had this year, where there was so much water, it came over the top of Fremont Weir and took those little 3-inch fish and just washed them down into the yellow bypass. We heard from researchers in DWR that they were down in there sampling those fish, and they were as big as trout by the time they caught up with them. That means by the time they get out into the ocean, their chances of survival are much higher. But that's only happening once every 10 years when we have really high flows. Notch Fremont Weir, we can get those fish down there even in lower water years. Restoration of Painter's Riffle, one of the spawning areas in the upper Sac, is one that we worked on with the Glen Colusa Irrigation District. You might have seen quite a bit of press over the last few months about the insertion of root wads in the upper Sac River walnut tree trunks with their roots attached to giant boulders dropped into the river. The idea there, and this was called for in our rebuilding plan, is to create both velocity refugia. These little guys are poor swimmers. They're out in the middle of that big raging river. They need a place where they can hold. They can get behind that root wad, and that thing acts like prison bars. When the big predator fish come at them, they just go into the roots, and they're safe in there. So they get predation refuge, they get velocity refuge, and we have to tip our hats to River Garden Farms, another irrigation district in the Sac Valley that put the money up to get that project done. Let me just flag that the habitat restoration projects are probably the easier ones, although when you get out to floodplain restoration, you're talking about some big landscape scale stuff. That's a little tougher. But when we get out into the flow issues, now you're in real hard territory. And Vice Chair Moore, I didn't realize you were the Vice Chair. I heard you calling for collaboration with our friends on the agricultural side. We would like to, but when it comes to this flow business, we're in a tough spot. I mean, I hearken back to the UC Davis slide that showed that we're 5 times over allocated. And I think everybody in the room recognizes that water is money. So who wants to give up money? And that's where we come before you and ask for your help, because we're going to need your help on these flow measures. You're aware better than I of what's become of the settlement discussions on the San Joaquin side. My understanding is they're not moving. I'm not certain what's going on the Sac side, and the Delta is yet ahead. This is tough ground ahead. But these are some of the bigger and biggest issues that we're facing, and we're really going to need your help.
Just want to also obviously echo the thanks from the other board members. I know you traveled a long way, and it's, the human aspect is certainly a critical one, especially as this work can get somewhat technical. This is all very personal to you and your communities, and that's understood on all sides. I know that the word collaboration continues to come up, and Craig was the first one to really bring it up, and I know that there's a great amount of skepticism when it comes to the voluntary settlement discussions that's going on from some, and but know that we're only going to be able to really solve this in a collaborative way. I know flows are thorny, but just encourage people to continue to kind of come to the table and try to find that common ground. I guess I would just have a question, Mr. McManus. If you had had an opportunity, I know last week the California Natural Resources Agency put out their Sacramento Valley Salmon Resiliency Strategy. Flows are part of that, more in the tributaries, I believe, in Butte and Mill and Antelope Creeks. Did you have any comment and or any sort of feedback or insight as to the appropriateness or the feasibility, I guess, of that strategy and where you see that playing in?
You know, if they achieved everything they call for in that plan, we'd be ahead of the game. That's for darn sure. I would flag that the dewatering of reds, salmon nests in the upper Sac is not in that plan. The call for temperature control to protect fall run is not in that plan. There's nothing in there about fixing the thermal pollution problem coming out of Thermalito. On the other hand, they call attention to the need to get juvenile salmon down into the Yolo and the Sutter bypasses. Crucial. You know, I would say that relative to the Yolo bypass, they're already required under the salmon biological opinion to do that. So they're basically restating a pre-existing requirement. Nonetheless, it would be gargantuan to get those fish down there in lower than flood years. Let me put it differently. So the fish that were counted down there at trout size basically were born in 2016. We will see them as adults in the ocean in 2019. I will put a prediction out here today that we'll have a decent season in 2019. So the name of the game is to replicate that even in non-flood years. And it's not that hard to do. There are structural issues in the way. The Corps of Engineers, the Flood Board probably get heartburn when you talk about notching the Fremont Weir. Maybe this group can help us push that. But NIMS is recognized as crucial, and we absolutely agree with them. And I think the evidence coming off the Yellow Bypass this year supports that.
Thank you.
Yeah, I just want to add my thanks to all. I mean, it's both sobering and inspiring at the same time. It's interesting as I think about so many of the issues that you've all raised. There are issues that we've dealt with probably more individually than collectively in the field, and you pulled it all together in a way that's really good. My brain is spinning, and I know that I may not feel that way, that we're pretty Bay Delta centric because of the enormity of the water quality control plan update, whether settlement or regulation or however we do it. And the goal is to bring people together even under our regulatory proposal, because people working together on the ground dealing with timing of flows, whatever they are, as well as habitat restoration and the other things, is what's going to make the difference. And I appreciate that two things. One, that you managed to, in a really good way, strike home the real impact of where we are, while also retaining hope that there's stuff that can be done, which I think is the best kind of advocacy out there that we don't see enough of. So thank you from the bottom of my former advocacy heart, because we just don't see that as much as we should in terms of trying to figure out what can we do and how to motivate and see spaces where we can pull it together for the common good. So I really appreciate what you've brought to this presentation, and a really good reminder of the enormity of the whole of the Klamath system and its connection back to the Shasta and the Scott, in addition to the Bay Delta issues that we're so steeped in. We're obviously very steeped in some of the Klamath issues from time to time. I know spending a lot of time on the Scott a few years ago, but not as much recently. Just the array of issues that you've raised is motivating. If I don't see the path right now, you've motivated me to think about how to pull it together, and certainly all terrific partners to be able to work with. I do have one little, I'm going to go from the sublime to the mechanic in me. 5937, yeah, you put it in a really good way. It's sort of like the most powerful tool you don't see used very often. What is the enforcement tool for 5937? I'm embarrassed to say I don't know. I talk about 5937 a lot, but I don't realize who wields the tool, how we what our role is.
So
and
typically
where
it gets
plays.
incorporated in, keep in mind 5937 applies to a dam.
Right.
And typically it gets incorporated as a permit condition and then a license condition term within a water board permit. And so in those instances, the water board has the authority. However, there is independent authority to enforce 5937, and that's what you see when you look at the Supreme Court's Mono Lake, or the follow-on to the Supreme Court's Mono Lake decisions, and look at what the Third District Court of Appeal did in Caltrout 1 and 2 with respect to the State Water Board. They recognize there is an independent authority to enforce.
In a lawsuit, is what you're saying.
Correct. And so within that, it was an action by the board to enforce 5937. However, it could also be brought as an independent action against the dam operator.
And how about Department of Fish and Wildlife?
You know, to be honest, I've never really considered the issue of how and whether they have direct independent authority, because I'm not as familiar with which articles and divisions of the Fish and Game Code. I'm going to look if Tina wants to be put on the spot, since she had previously advised the department, but I'm not sure if they have an independent enforcement mechanism within the Fish and Game Code.
If I may.
Yeah, please.
I just, there's very few 1600 permits in this state that have a mandatory bypass flow requirement. I filed Public Records Act requests for every 1600 permit in Siskiyou County, and I was going to do every one in California, and they called me and begged me not to, because it's like, turns out there's a bunch of them. But there's a very small handful of 1600 permits in this state that have a, and I just think there needs to be some kind of programmatic approach that anytime you get a 1600 permit, there should be a mechanism to say, okay, well, you can have your dam or diversion or stream bed alteration, but here's your obligation to leave flows behind. And it can't be just, right now it's just sort of, it's ambiguous, and it's up to, you know, citizen suits and things like that to kind of get at it. But I think we could program it, make it programmatic whenever there's a 1600 permit that there has to be 5937 compliance. But we have dams, I know there's dams in the Klamath Basin that don't even have a 1600 permit. Young's Dam on Scott River don't even have a 1600 permit. So, you know, I think there's a lot of this stuff going around where we don't need to pass a bunch of new laws, but we have to develop some kind of program to enforce what's on the book. Yeah.
But 1600 being lake and stream bed alteration agreements, that's a Fish and Wildlife permit. In terms of our history in this, I know with FERC relicensing and 401 certification, we will work with Department of Fish and Wildlife and stakeholders, dam operators, to come up with proposed bypass flows. So there is a role that the state board plays, but it's not directly in 1600, right?
And I'll just point out that a number of years ago, and it culminated in a reported case about 4 years ago involving the Siskiyou County Farm Bureau, the Department of Fish and Wildlife was actually exploring having a programmatic Section 1600 program within the Scott and Shasta River system specifically. And I actually do not know the current status. I think that while ultimately the Department of Fish and Wildlife won the litigation in terms of how Section 1600 of the Fish and Game Code can be reconciled with the Water Board's Water Rights Authority, and that the Water Rights Authority that the board exercises does not completely displace the Section 1600 permits for diversions. Nonetheless, my understanding is Fish and Wildlife kind of moved to an alternative approach built on a more collaborative as opposed to a regulatory overlay, and I don't think that they've resurrected any of those efforts.
The one, to their credit, I will have to give a tip of the hat to the department. They did one of the biggest diversions on the Scott is called Farmer's Ditch diversion, and they did. You know, the winter flows came, washed away their push-up dam. They went back to put them in their push-up dam. The department showed up, says you can't do it without a permit. Made them get a 1600 permit and and established a bypass flow requirement at Farmer's Ditch. But it was like, I complained about Farmer's Ditch for 6 years, and I can't, if that's the rate of progress for me, if it's 6 years per diversion, the fish are going to go extinct before I get around to, you know, so we need to have something that's more programmatic and broadly applicable.
And this is an important theme that that 1600 can't go over this way, and then, any regional board basin plan action or water action plan base flows or whatever are disconnected. This has to be an aligned state agency effort, which I think was the heart of the action plan idea. Thanks for the update. It's, it's a work in progress, obviously. But in that regard, I think of the rapid, you talk about the pace, the time scale of the fisherman's economy and its viability. So, there is a time scale. It's a few years or so where devastation could occur. So that's an important point. But what things have happened awfully fast at the state level recently? Well, there was this legalization of recreational cannabis. And there was a requirement for the state board as part of licensing by the Department of Food and Ag for this new commodity for us to specify what low flows are necessary to sustain fisheries in these areas. It's part of an ongoing development of a program that I was briefed on just in the last couple of weeks, something that our regional boards are engaged in from the water quality standpoint. I don't, we're not going to promise any grand scale out of this, but what it does is it forces us to work with Fish and Wildlife to answer the question, when many cannabis farmers get together in a watershed and want to be licensed, we have to have an answer to that question of what flow requirements for that stream, just for the cannabis farmers in isolation, doesn't take into account other diversions in the watershed. But this is an area where we can hone our science, our collaboration, working with folks to come up with those kind of numeric thresholds that would guide that decision making. I mean, the staff, do you want to add anything to that? What's the pace of, how long would it take, given that, there's a time scale in terms of the degradation of coastal economies and tribal tradition? Is this something we can work on in the next year or two to have some templates that can be implemented in the cannabis program? Is it expected as part of what the statute has set up?
I think I'd like to just report back in terms of the staff's ability to incorporate. Obviously, we have our own authorities that would provide ample opportunity, and we're trying to ensure that the both water quality and water rights components will adequately protect all beneficial uses. But we have to recognize that the way that the language is written, it is particularly tied to fish and wildlife. And as you know, the staff are already working with a very aggressive timeline on that. So I'll report back in terms of what additional bells and whistles could be incorporated.
Yeah, I just point that out to the panel to let you know that we're grappling with these issues and, how the thresholds would be implemented in that program. And I think there's some relevancy to the broader question of how we go about setting flow requirements for public trust protection and, the sustainability of our fishery-based economy.
I just want to thank you guys for the inspiration. A lot to chew on, but actually a lot to the integration of a lot of threads that are obviously integrated, but at least I personally have dealt with in isolation. You're pulling it together is motivating and inspiring. There's obviously a lot going on. But thank you for taking the time. This was a really good idea, and I really appreciate it. Chris, do you want to have the last word? Yeah, they have done a great job. Thank you very much. Nice to see you all. All right. Let me see if I can get the number right. Item number 7 is board member reports. And we haven't done this in a little while. Or did we do a little abbreviated one last time? We might have. All right, who wants to start? Right or left? Right.
So 2 weeks ago now, Board Member Moore and I actually attended the Santa Ana River Watershed Authority conference.
Oh,
wow.
How was that? Oh, I
it
did
was-
say that, didn't I? That's funny.
It went, yeah, it went very well. It was fantastic. I was fortunate enough to be able to stay the entire day, so got to see hear all the panels, see all the panels, and really good discussions. It was board member Moore had a particularly memorable presentation to provide, and so yeah, it was a good event. Next week, National Governors Association is putting together a roundtable and discussion about healthy communities, and one aspect of that will be water and healthy communities, so affordability, et cetera. So staff has prepared some material for me to be able to make sure and hit on and deliver for next week, but I'll be participating in that panel. And so it won't just be government folks, it's others, stakeholders, et cetera. So it's kind of national discussion. So that'll be good in DC. So.
With the water fix hearing on break, I actually was able to do other things. I will report on just two things. Last week, the Central Valley Regional Water Board held a workshop to present and take comments on the proposed climate change work plan. If you remember, we adopted the climate change resolution, and the Central Valley Regional Board is now actually, I can forward you a copy of their draft work plan. It's relatively succinct, around 40 pages, that outlines their understanding of how climate change might be impacting some of the Central Valley Board's program areas, and more importantly, the proposed as well as current actions that they are taking to address the issue of climate change. They went into quite a level of extensive analysis and presentation of these efforts, as well as an attempt to trying to prioritize what they might do to help the issue of resiliency. So I highly recommend it. It's not something that they have taken action on yet. It's just out for public comment right now, but I think it's very thought-provoking, and obviously they've spent quite a bit of time and effort preparing this document. And then the other thing I wanted to give you a heads up on, and Vice Chair Moore has expressed an interest in attending some of the storms related to meetings that staff has been conducting, and I would welcome his engagement in that. Yesterday there was another follow-up meeting with respect to the zinc effort. Just a reminder, one of the storms project was the idea of looking at how do we perhaps look at zinc from a source control perspective. And one of the things that was being considered was perhaps developing a petition to the Department of Toxics to look at zinc in tires as part of their consumer products regulations and effort. Without getting into a lot of detail, a lot of the discussion yesterday was based on some of the technical analysis that went into the CASCA report that prompted this idea that tires and zinc in tires was an issue that had to be addressed in order for municipalities to comply with their various TMDLs. So we spent some time on that, but also we spent quite a bit of time on AB 1800, I believe it was 1180. Without getting into a lot of details, because we don't discuss legislation, AB 1180 actually would require the Department of Toxic Substance Control to revise their priorities list to include zinc and zinc in tires. So as you can imagine, there was quite a bit of discussion yesterday about it, and I expect there will be additional discussion. I believe the legislation has passed out of the Assembly and will now be considered by the Senate. But that's an item that staff and Elisa is particularly following, and I believe we will have at least an informational item or an update from staff in July on this matter.
Well, it's been a while, so I have 9 items here. It's been a couple, just in the last month. So while you all
Really, I need more coffee.
But Board Member Esquivel already covered one of them, so that's good. Yeah, but I wasn't.
I'm sorry, are they in prioritized order, chronological order? Or?
I have them chronological because I wasn't here last board meeting. So, and also you all have been so busy in the water fix hearings that, make sure that the state water board members are out there doing things. So
Yeah, thank you for all of the miles you've logged on our behalf.
thank you. Thank you very much. I appreciate all the service of the hearing officers and Board Member Diadamo. So I'll go down pretty rapid fire for the clerk. But on May 9th, I spoke at the Headwaters Resiliency Conference that the Sierra Fund, the Sierra Nevada Conservancy, and others put on about mercury item that we adopted. But also they were interested in the mercury in reservoirs issue because there are impairment listings around the state, and it's a very challenging issue to manage. And so I was on a panel with several folks about that issue and checked in with staff about that. Then on May 10th, I moderated a panel at the Aqua Conference in Monterey. I was asked to by Paul Cook of Irvine Ranch Water District, and I worked with Dave Boland on an issue I don't have direct expertise in, but certainly learned a lot on water reliability planning in the 21st century. And we had speakers from state, Integrated Regional Water Management, Art Hinojosa. Then we went to Metropolitan Water District, MoDOC, the Orange County Wholesaler, and then down to Irvine from perspectives on new tools, doing data analytics for water supply reliability. The punchline was by working together regionally, you identify projects that are a higher priority than doing so in isolation. And they have tools that they're refining for smaller to mid-size agencies to be able to use to have that better context. So, and it relates obviously to what we work on in conservation, that sort of thing. So that was a great opportunity to work with those folks. On May 11th, I went to the Central Coast Regional Water Board for my final liaison report. And while I was down there, I met with folks that are forming GSAs for Sigma, a group of farmers in the Paso Robles area. I think it's known as the EPS, some water districts, some individual landowners that are forming the GSA. And then I met with county staff, San Luis Obispo County, to get an update on what they're working on to avoid creating overlap or gaps in coverage. To say it's non-controversial would not be forthcoming. It's a difficult situation that folks are working very hard to try to come to resolution with a proposal to us to be in compliance with Sigma. And so it was good to have a dialogue. On May 12th, then while I was down there, I toured the new Los Osos wastewater treatment plant and reclamation facility, which it's a gorgeous facility. And it's getting up and running. They were describing some of their startup challenges and techniques they're using to keep the plant going and all the different processes. From an engineer standpoint, very, very interesting to look at their design and their operation. On May 18th, I was at the North Coast Regional Water Board. A lot of information items there. Actually, Chief Deputy Director John Bishop joined me to meet with some folks to discuss TMDL implementation and sediments in particular. But also they covered areas, Board Member Dodek just mentioned the Stormwater Initiative. There's an entity, the Russian River Watershed Association, which really pulls together the county and the different cities in the whole watershed. And they got grant funding that they were talking about from us on Prop 1 stormwater planning. And they seem to be very motivated and excited about taking the stormwater resource plan to the next step. So that was encouraging. As you know, I think that's the modern storm drain master plan, which really helps us communicate to the public the need to help fund these systems that really support our quality of life. And along those lines, on May 23rd, the US EPA has given a grant to BASMA, which is the Bay Area Stormwater Management Association of Agencies, and they're holding these urban greening Bay Area workshops, and the focus is looking at not only stormwater funding mechanisms that were under discussion, but thinking of transportation as an important overlay for defining projects and funding them. And Matt Fabry, who's the head of BASMA, also at San Mateo County, was heading that effort, and there are a number of cities in attendance. And so that's an important little process going on that US EPA is helping to fund. And it's promising because they're really bringing green infrastructure in the front and center of stormwater infrastructure management at the national level. And that's nice to see because that wasn't that way even 4 or 5 years ago, in my opinion. So I see that as a really helpful potential federal-state partnership. And May 24th, I gave the closing plenary speech at the Headwaters to Ocean Conference that was held at UC Irvine, focusing on my theme of connections, which we all talk about, connectivity, connecting the water cycle back to itself, people to water, and then people to each other in managing water from institutional standpoint, from perspectives, different perspectives. And then the next day with Board Member Esquivel at the One Water, One Watershed Conference, it was Celeste Cantu's final. She gave a pretty long lunchtime speech, but it was excellent. And her theme was taking a finite resource of water and making it infinite. And that was, she gave me credit actually, because that was something we talked about and noodled on, that water, if you think about it, it can be used and reused and reused. And also the effects of wise and sustainable water management reverberate through the community in an infinite way and create connections between people. So that was wonderful to see her there. I'm sorry, Celeste says, well, I'm going to retire from SAPA. And I said, oh, wow. What are we going to do? Or, ow, ow, right?
Oh, ow, right.
That was it. So at any rate, she's working for, I know the acronym, it's WELL, it's Water Education Latino, for Latino leaders or by Latino leaders. And so I think we'll hear much more from her in the future, which is great. She's an important statewide voice and leader. On June 1st, I went to the Los Angeles Regional Board to do a liaison report. And on June 5th, yesterday, I met with the Tuolumne River Trust and did a field trip. If I look a little red in the face, we were out at the Dos Rios Ranch seeing the floodplain restoration work that they've done collaboratively with the water users in Tuolumne River area. And amazing how much riparian trees grow in just 3 or 4 years. It's a stunning transformation that they're accomplishing and bodes well for projects in the future. And that's my
Wow, that's
report.
great. Thank you.
Thanks.
It was a whirlwind tour.
I know.
I just have one thing to report on, and that is that yesterday the chair and Mr. Loeffler and I went to the Merced River, and we did the helicopter flyover. So for those of you who have not had that opportunity, including staff that's working on this, I would really encourage it. I've been out on the river many times, but hadn't had an opportunity to fly over, and it's just really useful to see not only how unique the Merced is, but how unique it is in different sections. And really, it's just a stark contrast between the area immediately below Crocker-Huffman and the potential suitability with some restoration efforts to get some good habitat there, and then lower in the river, maybe suitability for habitat, but not necessarily for salmon. But some good ideas that the district had, and we were out there with Joe Mertz, their biologist, and Jim Lynch, that's working with the district on FERC relicensing, and just a really good discussion. And just a little postscript on some of the comments that John made earlier, McManus, about phase one. The discussions really are continuing on the San Joaquin, but it's probably just one-on-one discussions as opposed to the larger group discussions. And I know that in conversations with the Merced Irrigation District General Manager, John Swigert, that he's been having some good discussions with Chuck Bonham, kind of more, direct discussions. So hopefully those conversations will be productive. And then with what you were looking at on the Tuolumne and on the stand as well.
Yeah, it was great. It's always good to see things. It's worth all kinds of words, more than 1,000 words, but both in terms of seeing the challenges, but seeing the opportunities opportunities as well. So I appreciate that was time really well spent. The only other two things I'd mention, in addition to being able to just catch up on briefings, because there's so much going on here, it was really pretty inspiring to just do a day of briefings or a day of conversations with people, as opposed to not being able to. That's been good the last week or so. I spent the day at a convening that's a follow-on to a trip that Vice Chair Moore took to Israel. It was this time hosted by CDFA, and it was just really interesting to spend a day thinking about the similarities and differences, a lot about technology, a lot of really interesting, a really interesting panel on salinity management and some of the things that the Israelis have, and one person in particular where you can't just do it in 1 year, you have to look at it over time. And so, for example, looking at their work to use, they recycle 80-something% of their water and use it for agriculture, but after 5 years, the salinity in the soil was starting to tank the plants, and they started moving more expensive water, but desal in to freshen it up. But just really the systems management approach that they need to take because of their circumstances, and that they can take because of their size, scale, and institutional structure, are just, it's not that we either need to or can do what they've done, but it was inspiring to see how they think about it and how they've evolved. So it was an interesting day, and a lot of just cool technology and stuff that they're doing, in addition to the our folks being able to show off a little bit as well on different issues. Very much a mutual set of panels, so it was really quite interesting. And the only other thing I did that I wasn't inspiring, but it was inspiring to me, was Commonwealth Club Climate One session with Buzz Thompson from Stanford Law School, and Don Cameron, farmer who's doing so many innovative things, including sort of the flooding of almond fields to see, and he has vineyard. But I didn't realize he's like on the cutting edge of everything. So it was just, it was great to be able to spend that much time with someone who's kind of a yes we can, let's see if we can do it kind of a guy, and a real leader. So that was great for me. So I encourage you, I don't know when it's going to be running on the radio, I encourage you to listen to it, and don't listen to anything I said, but listen for Don Cameron. Yeah, exactly. So that's it, I think, for the moment. All right. We had continued our closed session. I think we'll need to continue it again unless you see any value in.
I think it would be good, first of all, there will not be a closed session on the water fix item, but I think it would be good to have a personnel closed session briefly.
Okay, good. Fine.
For reasons that will be explained.
Okay.
So it's about 12:15. I don't know if the board wants to go right into closed session or take a brief break. I don't expect it would be a long closed session.
I don't mind going right in.
Okay. So then the board will retire or recess to closed session on the personnel item, and will not be meeting in closed session on Cal Water Fix.
Thank you for that. I always forget.